Alright, so when you first install Unity and you open it up, it actually looks pretty scary. It's pretty intimidating. You see all these windows and you think, well, what's this project window? What's the console window? What do all these things do? It's actually pretty simple when you think about it. Now, for example, this window right here is called the hierarchy window. It shows basically everything in our game. The scene view is basically the behind the scenes view of our game, so everything right here is just behind the scenes. We can see the camera if we have game objects. For example, if we have some squares, we can rename these squares in the hierarchy. Maybe square, and we can rename it. We can make it parents of other objects, which I'll go into what that actually means in a moment, which actually sounds pretty weird if you're saying that to a normal person. So what we can do in the scene view is actually we can move the different objects in our game. So for example, we have this game object. It's called the square game object. We can move it in our scene. We can duplicate it using Control D, and we can move it in our scene. Now we can actually move it because of this tool right here. It's called the move tool. Now these are all the tools we have in and we can use in the scene view. For example, this is the view tool. If you click on it, and you can move. Basically, it's basically the same as the move or the view tool in Photoshop. When you hold on the spacebar and you move, that's basically the same thing. But what I usually like to do is I just hold the right mouse button and I'll move around like this, or the cursor. If I just hold on the cursor, I can move. This is the rotate tool. The hotkey for it is E. This, you can basically just rotate around game objects. This is the scale tool. The hotkey for it is R. You can basically scale different game objects equally. Basically scale different game objects. You can scale it on the x-axis or on the y-axis. You can also scale it on the z-axis, but for example, if I want to make it 3, but we're actually making a 2D game, so whatever you do on the z-axis in a 2D game, it doesn't really matter whether it's the scale or the position. You can even scale it evenly in all sides. So we just scaled it right here using these little options, but you can even scale it evenly if you would like. And then we have this rec tool. I think it's called the rec tool. So what this basically does is that, well, it's basically the same as this scale tool, but you can customize it more. It has more options. Maybe you want to make it longer on one side and keep it in its same position, or maybe in this side. Or you can make it bigger here. Click on Shift to make it bigger at the same. Hold on Shift and scale it up, just to make it like scale evenly. Or you can click on Alt and Shift. You can make it scale evenly and make it stay in place. So if you know Photoshop, or you know like very basics in Photoshop, it's basically the same as the Photoshop hotkeys. And lastly, we have this tool, which is basically a mix of everything. I've never really used this tool, and I don't think I'm actually gonna be needing it. And neither do you. Just use these tools. So just to say it again, the move tool is W. You can move on different objects. You can move different objects in your scene. The E key is for rotating. The R key is for scaling. The T key is for rect. And the Y key, nobody really uses it, so just leave it really. So yeah, these are the basic 4 main keys. Don't worry too much about memorizing them. It'll come to you with time. So that's the scene view. We then have the game view, which is basically just everything inside our main camera. I'm gonna put this to 16:9. You can maximize or minimize windows using the Shift and space. Just basically hold on Shift and then click on space. You can do that for different windows too. So for example, if you want to maximize the scene window, Shift and then click on space. Same thing for the hierarchy. The hierarchy basically just shows everything as a list. So it shows everything in our scene view, but just as a list. So if we, for example, make different copies of this, make a circle. Yeah, it shows us the different objects in our scene. We have the circle right here. What we can do is we use this a lot in game development. Game developers use this a lot. So you can make an object a child of an object. So for example, we want to move the circle, the square will move with it. So it's basically a child, the square is a child of the circle game object. And you can add in multiple game objects. So yeah, and for example, if we restore the reset property, if we restore the position, and let's make this square black and set the ordinal layer to 1. And actually, if we look at the position, it's 0 by 0 by 0. But we know, but the position of this square, if we set it as 0 by 0 by 0, this is the 0 position when it's an actual normal square. But when it's a square connected or a child of another game object, the game object will actually like take it over basically. So whenever we put on 0, it's basically the same position as the parent game object. Well, if we don't have a parent game object and we set it to 0, it's going to be normally 0. So yeah, you can add in different sprites or different objects. Just go to the hierarchy, right click and click on 2D object, sprites, and select the sprite you would like. For example, if you want a capsule, it spawns in this capsule right here. If you want for example, a light, you can spawn in the different lights here. These are actually 3D lights, they're not 2D lights, so don't spawn in these lights. We'll go through how to spawn in 2D lights in future lessons. You can actually spawn particles too, and then make it a prefab. This is the project window. So basically this project window shows us everything that we have. This project window, and this is the assets section. So we have the different folders, we have the packages, which is everything, all the packages we have, we're gonna use. Just don't think about this too much, we're not gonna be using this at all. We're mostly just going to be using this assets section. So this assets section is actually everything we're going to be using in our game. So for example, all the audio effects, all the sound effects, all the music we're going to be using, all the 3D models if we're making a 3D game, all the 2D sprites if we're creating a 2D game. You can actually search up here, all models, all prefabs, and all materials. We don't have anything in our assets section, so it doesn't show anything really. When you create a new project, it just basically puts in this folder called scenes. This is automatically put in. So this basically has our sample scene. I'm just gonna save it. This is basically our scene right here. So this is called the sample scene. Scenes are basically different levels. This right here is the inspector window. So we have, for example, this game object. If we want to make another game object, we can go to create empty and it'll spawn in another game object. Let's reset it. All right, so what this inspector basically is that it shows us everything in our game object, or shows us all the details and information we want about our game object. So it shows us its name right here. It shows us its tag or the layer. It shows us if it's static or not. It shows us the position coordinates, the rotation details, and the scale details. So basically everything we need to know about the different game objects. So all of them right here are all different game objects. So this is a game object, this is a game object, this is a game object. All of them are different game objects. They're all called game objects. And you can add different components here. So this transform component is automatically added in every game object. But you can add different components to your game object. So for example, when we add a square sprite, it actually has a transform component, but it also has a sprite renderer component. What this sprite renderer does, as it is named, it just basically renders the sprite, and the selected sprite right here is called the square. Now, if we have different sprites, it'll show right here, but these are basic sprites that come with Unity. So you put in the OK. Yeah, it's very small, but you get the idea. You can search for it if you want. Yeah, here it is. Square. This is the color of our different sprite, so you can actually change this. This is to flip the X. This is to flip it on the X-axis or on the Y-axis. Currently, it doesn't make any sense because it's actually a square. So if you flip it on the Y-axis, it's still gonna stay the same. But if we have an actual sprite with like actual drawings and actual features, it'll look different. Basically, these two just make sure which one is showing on top of which. So which sprite is showing on top of which. So for example, this ordinal layer for this sprite is 1. So automatically when we put this sprite over or under the sprite, it shows up under the square sprite, because the square sprite is a higher ordinal layer than this. So it's basically telling Unity to stop. Do not render this over this. Always render this black square over the white square. We can change this by maybe making it 2. And now it's rendering over the black square. Now we can do this, which is 1, 2, and can like index it out, or basically give different numbers or indexes. But you can also give different sorting layers. We're not going to use the sorting layer much. This is the console window. What this basically does is that it checks, it's basically the debug window. So it checks if we have any errors in our game. And also you can actually rearrange the windows. So something like this. Maybe, I don't know, I like this layout more. But let's say you went overboard and you customized it a bit too much. So basically to revert it is actually pretty easy. You just go to Window, go to Layouts, and select Reset All Layouts. Continue. Awesome. It's all back to normal. You actually have different layouts here, so just go to Layout, maybe 2x3. But yeah, I'm just gonna keep it on the default layout. Yeah, I like this default layout way more. See you in the next lesson.